We stand opposed to US-Israeli attacks in this expanding war front. We condemn the US and Israel attack on Iran. The cycle of aggression aimed at provoking wider war serves only the interest of arms manufacturers and ruling elites that seek to entrench themselves in control and domination. Military escalation and war will not bring peace and security, but only further deepen the suffering of the region's people. Let's begin with our first speaker, Attorney Edre Olalia. Attorney Edre Olalia is currently serving as president of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers from 2025 to 2029. Attorney Edre Olalia was the former Secretary General and President, and now convener and chairperson of the National Union of People's Lawyers, a nationwide private organization of pro bono human rights activist lawyers. As an activist and people's lawyer, Attorney Edre has spent 35 years practicing pro bono and public interest law, defending human rights and marginalized communities. He was the lead private counsel behind the critical last-minute efforts that secured a reprieve from execution for Mary Jane Veloso, a trafficked Filipina domestic worker in Indonesia falsely accused as a drug mule by an international syndicate. He was also head juror in the International People's Tribunal on U.S. imperialism, sanctions, blockades, and economic coercive measures, and attended in person the Venezuela session in July 2023. Once again, we have Attorney Edre to discuss why we consider sanctions, particularly unilateral sanctions of the U.S., as weapons of war. The floor is now yours, Attorney.
Thank you, Johnny. Good morning from Manila, colleagues, friends, and comrades. And of course, thank you to the organizers, the Resist US-led War Movement in Asian Pacific Campaign, and the ILPS Asian Pacific. Well, I was requested to talk about unilateral sanctions, and I hope that after this very compact presentation, I will be able to help validate, not establish, but to validate why unilateral sanctions are acts of imperialist war, aggression, and intervention. Of course, I'm no authority. And by the way, good morning to your excellencies who are my co-speakers. I'm no authority, but I will try my best to help fortify, because it is a fact, fortify the fact that sanctions play a key role in the overall agenda of the US empire. With your permission, can you hear me loud and clear before I continue any further, Chani? Okay. I will draw and quote extensively from the verdict and the findings of the International People's Tribunal on US imperialism, sanctions, blockades, and economic coercive measures of 2022 to 2023, of which, as Johnny mentioned, I was one of the jurors, and where we held 15 country hearings over time, examining the impact of these economic coercive measures on the lives of the people of the global south, and where I, in fact, participated in person in the Venezuela session in Caracas way back in July 2023. This is still relevant and still current under the present circumstances, especially what is happening or what's happened in particular in Venezuela, now in Iran, and in Cuba, and many other countries. The world has witnessed an unprecedented proliferation of sanctions regimes, mainly by the United States and its allies, to perpetuate US military, political, and economic hegemony. Regrettably, the law, international law, and domestic law enabled the instrumentalization to legitimize and justify sanctions as a lawful weapon to punish nations or peoples who refuse to submit to the US dictates. I will be presenting three thesis statements for this presentation. First, economic coercive measures or unilateral coercive measures, UCM henceforth for brevity. Unilateral coercive measures or UCM are inherently violent. They are designed to maintain economic inequality, and continue the theft of wealth from the global south. Second, UCMs are designed to destroy the economies of formerly colonized global south nations and make them subservient to the US and its partners. And finally, as a thesis, the United States and its allies are unwilling to relinquish this weapon of coercive measures as a tool of imperial control, infliction of suffering, the theft of such resources, and the forced compliance with US dictates. What are UCMs and their impact? In addition to the confiscation and freezing of sovereign assets of the global south countries in banks, among others, of course, the policy of economic coercive measures has included imposing sanctions on vessels and oil tankers, the boarding and confiscation at sea of cargoes of oil and other valuable goods, and their auction for the benefit of the sanctioned regimes, and even the imprisonment and torture of diplomats like Mr. Saab and officials carrying out sanctions busting trades on international scene. UCMs and the confiscation or freezing of sovereign funds have been instituted upon several countries in retaliation for the nationalization or expropriation of economic assets and national resources and or the rejection of continued concessions to US and other multinational corporations. The perpetrators of such sanctions seek to compel nations to accept the continued imperial extraction of their wealth and resources. Within the context of the global economy, sanctioned nations with significant oil and gas resources like Venezuela and Iran have, by and large, so far fared better, with exceptions, than those without such resources, as the value of access to such resources compels third party nations to break the sanctions in order to engage in trade. However, nations with such significant resources, such as Venezuela again and Iran, have been particularly heavily targeted for coercive economic measures as a means of economic control. In general, the sanctions on the local economy of sanctioned states, from North Korea to Cuba to Yemen to Syria to Lebanon to Venezuela and many others, is devastating, setting the economic development clock back, sometimes irreversibly, even when the targeted country can arrange for a certain amount of supplies of food and medicine to be delivered via an intrepid or fearless trading partner, and that all targeted countries suffer from extraordinarily high rates of inflation, which put the basic requirements of life beyond the reach of most people. Sanctions, in short, hurt the targeted country even when that country can get, for some reason, the help of some friendly countries willing to break the sanctions against it. UCMs are indiscriminate instruments. They impact the economy as a whole and hence the entire people in the country. One cannot escape them by changing one's location within the country. In fact, because of their extraterritorial and chilling effects, civilians are affected even when or if they leave their countries, with many reporting difficulties such as opening bank accounts abroad or even transferring money back to their families. UCMs, furthermore, inflict harm on civilians, which is intentional. Civilian suffering is not merely an unintended collateral damage, it is precisely the means through which UCMs hope to achieve their objectives by, for example, contributing to conditions that can force regime change, just like what we are seeing and saw in Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Libya, Iran, and many others. The degree of suffering they inflict is enormous. Every sanctioned country had experienced food and medicine shortages with devastating impacts, particularly among the most vulnerable civilians, including the elderly, people with disabilities, children and expectant mothers, and persons who are in greater need of medicines like those with cancer and who, by general consent, are supposed to be spared as much as possible the horrors of war. The attack on civilians is also systematic and widespread. It is not only indiscriminate, it is not only intentional, they are also systematic and widespread because they can be deployed indefinitely with almost no justification and scrutiny. In fact, the sanctions against Cuba and Korea, the TPRK, for instance, have been in force for decades, and as have the sanctions on Iran. Hence, the deliberate undermining of political sovereignty and territorial integrity of these countries have been particularly prevalent in the sanctions adopted against the countries which first countries which implemented, for instance, far-reaching programs of land redistribution or nationalization or development and industrialization, such as in Zimbabwe, or countries that supported national liberation movements, such as Libya, or countries or nations that threatened the US's geopolitical dominance in West Asia, such as the oil producing countries of Iraq, Iran, and Syria, and socialist nations that have refused to submit to global capitalism, such as Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. What then is the difference between overt and even covert armed force vis-a-vis unilateral coercive measures? The fact that unilateral coercive measures impact gradually, unfolding over time, or that the direct casualties they inflict occur in hospitals among people, for instance, suffering for all kinds of ailments because of lack of essential medicines, or at home because of the lack or paucity of food that makes a person vulnerable to diseases, makes people suffering seem not only less horrendous than the effects of civilian bombing, but also unrelated to the sanctions in any direct causal manner. Yet, the effects of unilateral coercive measures are no less devastating than the effects of civilian bombings during wars. UCMs are forceful coercive measures with effects that, in our contemporary age of global capitalism and reliance on the market for the provision of key means of subsistence, differ little from the deployment of armed force. Differ little from the deployment of armed force. In fact, their effects can even be more widespread, long lasting, and agonizing. It follows that unilateral sanctions are not only an implicit form of warfare, but a form that is even more pernicious or dangerous than open military force because of its apparent
Hello, Edre. Hello, welcome back. If you could unmute your
okay.
audio.
Okay, there you go. I lost my connection. I think can you hear me now, Johnny?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, very well. So I was saying that the impact on civilian lives have been significant and is often cited by the proponents of coercive economic measures. Yet they seek to shift the blame to the governments of sanctioned countries rather than those responsible for imposing the sanctions. In conclusion, if I may conclude and capsulize, economic coercive or unilateral coercive measures are in fact illegal use of force. Why? Because they violate the rule of non-intervention between states. because they constitute a war crime and a crime against humanity because they are designed to destroy. Can you still hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm sorry because some calls are coming. I'm really sorry. Because they are designed to destroy the economies of formerly colonized global South nations and make them subservient to US and its partners. And finally, these measures are an illegal use of force because they are illegal under international human rights law. In fact, the perpetrators of unilateral coercive measures, not only in the United States, the EU, and even the United Nations for to a certain extent, and multinational corporations are guilty of fraud, of piracy, of conversion and colonial theft, and even the crime of apartheid and the crimes of genocide. The nature of the current financial order has increased the power of sanctions as a mechanism of economic war and increases the vulnerability of developing nations who have no alternative means for economic development. The result has been the emergence of a new system of financial imperialism as destructive and destabilizing as earlier forms of imperialism. In sum, unilateral sanctions are a key part of the comprehensive strategy of US imperialist aggression and intervention against countries and peoples and nations asserting sovereignty versus US economic, political, military, and cultural hegemony. There is a causal relation or direct correlation between unilateral sanctions by the US against countries on the one hand and US armed aggression and intervention against those countries. In short, these two is the double-barreled shotgun that US imperialism is using to perpetuate its monstrous global domination, for which we, you, and every peoples of the world should continue to fight without let up. Thank you. Maraming salamat po. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Edre, for the elaboration on how sanctions are used as weapons of war, and for your deeply informed and principled perspectives that connect law, activism, and human rights. I hope we were all able to gain more of an understanding of unilateral sanctions from Attorney Edre. So now let us invite Her Excellency Yadira Ledesma Hernandez, Ambassador to the Republic of Cuba to Malaysia, the Republic of the Philippines, and Brunei Darussalam. Her Excellency Hernandez has a master's degree in international relations, a former member of the Permanent Mission of Cuba to the United Nations in New York, and a law graduate from the University of Havana. Please welcome Her Excellency Yadira Ledesma Hernandez.
Good morning to all colleagues. Do you hear me? Do you hear me?
We can hear you clearly.
Okay. Good morning and thank you very much for the invitation. We believe that these kind of events are really important, in particular in the current international scenario, because we have witnesses that nowadays is critical to raise the voices from the global south against the injustice, and it is necessary an international mobilization against these new aggressions that are based on sanctions and unilateral and coercive measures against, in particular, countries from the global south. We have prepared small presentations based on the Cuban experience on the fields of sanctions. And we have called this the Cuban experience under 67 years of hostile US policy and the most comprehensive and prolonged system of sanctions, unilateral coercive measures applied against an entire country, resilience and achievements. I want to start saying that the blockade that we call it in Cuba, the economic, commercial, and financial blockades that US has imposed against Cuba is in a sense, a war against the dreams of powers against the 9 million of Cuba. In Cuba, the 80% of the population only have known a Cuba under sanctions. Despite the achievements of the revolutionary process, we have witnessed that these systems of sanctions have applied not only Cuba during 67 years. Nowadays, look like they have like a clear doctrine, and I really appreciate the explanation made by the previous speakers, and I really agree with the points he raised. Because nowadays, and before entering the Cuban experience, what we are witnessing is that it's clear, it's almost similar to an script. Those powers apply sanctions against countries. When you apply comprehensive system of sanctions, what happens is that the living condition of that population will deteriorate. When those living conditions deteriorate, some sectors of the population start thinking that their leaders are not doing their best. Then what occurs that they add these financings of subventions. Then some protests can take place in countries, and this is when the Western powers enter and say, "You see, we need to go there. We need to defend democracy. Those dictatorships are violating the human rights of their own people." And after that, there are more pretexts to reinforce those coercive measures against the population. And this is what's happening not only in Cuba, against Iran, against the Democratic Republic of Korea, sanctions also against Russia. This is a tool that have a doctrine behind. In the case of Cuba, the revolution triumphed in 1959. But then what happened it was that the USA during the colonial times they were almost the owner of our entire country. Then and a conflict of interests start from that point. Please put the next slides. And it was very clear the intentions since the earliest years of the revolution. In 1960, there was a memorandum saying how they need to conduct the policy against the revolutionary process. And they say all possible means must be employed rapidly to weaken the economic life of Cuba. A course of action which being as skillful and discreet as possible will achieve the greatest advance in depriving Cuba of money and supplies, thereby reducing its financial resources and real salaries, causing hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of the government. It was clear that since the beginning what were the intention. After that we have the presidential proclamation from Kennedy and they imposed that they call it embargo, but we call it a blockade. The next slide. During the different administration of US, they have reinforced and structured based on many regulations what has been this comprehensive system of sanctions against Cuba. Next slide. Then there are pillars that has been applied: economic blockade, disinformation campaigns, and political subventions. Nowadays, the disinformation campaigns is more critical because the new technologies now are using against the public opinion, and there are a lot of labs and we call it farms where boots are using to create negative content and narrative against our countries. If you can start searching, for example, about Cuba nowadays in internet, the main and the vast majority of information you will receive is the negative. where we have a problem where, for example, the country has a garbage because now we have problem with the fuel. But you will not find, for example, our massive vaccine campaigns. You will not see the achievements of the country. You will only see where are the problems to create that sensations of chaos and collapse of the process. The next slide. The blockade has been structured, in the case of Cuba, first with legislative support, then government policies and special plans of different US administrations, and then regulations from the Department of Treasury and Commerce of US that have in particular extraterritorial natures. And then you have those unilateral lists that are illegal because the US doesn't have any international mandate to create those unilateral lists to blame on different countries. They have lists that they call it those countries that they think are sponsors of terrorism, lists for the one they believe are develop trafficking in person or don't respect the freedom of religions, list for the one they believe violates the human rights. Those lists are a pretext to justify the imposition of coercive measures on different countries. Next slide. In particular, the extraterritorial nature of those coercive measures are the most clear example why those measures violate the international law, because doesn't only are related to policies in US and the concerned country, also affect third countries. Those are some examples of the sanctions against Cuba that you can, for example, any vessel in the world is prohibited from calling at US port for 6 months if it has previously called at the Cuban port. Imagine in the international trade, it's almost impossible to find in our area a vessel that have not any commercial interest to go to US. Then those are major obstacles for the normal development of the life in our countries. Next slide. Those here you can also find other examples of the scope of the sanctions against Cuba. Most of them supported by regulations that they have developed. For example, the Cuban Adjustment Act. This law in particular encouraged irregular migration to US, giving the Cubans a lot of prerogatives that differentiates from the treatment that they provide to another migrants. We have the Torricelli Acts in particular that establish sanctions to the countries that provide assistance to Cuba. We have also Helms-Burton Act. We have also the inclusion, exclusion, and re-inclusion of Cuba in the list alleged sponsors of terrorism. That is very crucial because based on that list, that of course is based on lies, have a very negative impact in the financial sector. Nowadays, banks face the problem that if they accept any transaction that comes or goes from or to Cuba, they can receive millionaire fines. And it's almost impossible for the Cuban government nowadays to find a bank that accepts a payment that comes from Cuba is willing to buy any supplies on import for our daily life in the country. Then a new tool has been implemented during the recent years and are those related to the persecution of feuds to a country. In particular, last month we received the new reinforcement on this field, and it was the executive order for the President Trump that threaten third countries with a trade tariff for the ones who sovereignly decide to sell fuel to Cuba. From our view, the scope of these measures is equivalent to the use of force because fuel is an indispensable resource for the survival of a nation. Then, if you impose sanctions and prohibitions on this, the humanitarian impact will be huge for the survival of the nation. And this is why we, based also on the conventions of the genocides, we are saying that this is a collective punishment to entire population. It's an act of genocide what is committed against the human population because it's against a vital resources. Next slide. There are another examples of the scope of the sanctions, and then this is the combination also with the millions in funding for subversion in Cuba. Cuba has been victim of a lot of terrorist acts. Yesterday also it was revealed to the public opinion the last attempt of a terrorist act against Cuba, and also the combination of the sanctions, the funding for the subversion, and the disinformation campaigns are part of this comprehensive structure of the sanctions against countries. And the last one is also to identify one of the achievements are also related to incomes to the countries. We are experiencing now a huge campaign against Cuban medical cooperation around the world. A huge campaign based on lies, saying that those doctors that from Cuba are working in different countries. Some of them is a free cooperation. Some of them is a service contract, and part of these incomes goes to the national care health system in Cuba. Then now they are saying that this is a slave work, and it's a huge campaign against this international cooperation of Cuba in the medical field. Next slide. There are some figures that speak louder on this negative consequence of this unilateral coercive measure, these sanctions. Last year, the estimated cost of the blockade it was 7.5 billions of dollars. For a small economy like the Cuban economy, this is a huge obstacles for the survival of the nation. You can see, for example, the cost of 16 days of blockade is equivalent to the financing required to meet the country's national list of essential medicine. The negative impact of those sanctions is in many sectors, and is the population that every day need to overcome those obstacles. We always have a question: how much more could Cuba do without blockade for its people and also for the international cooperation? And it's clear that with this damage, you reduce the possibility to maintain the achievements, in our case, of the Cuban revolutionary process. Next slide. Every year during the last 30 years at the United Nations is presented a resolution that have the support of the vast majority of the international community calling for the lifting of the blockade. And for Cuba, this international support, the solidarity support, this international call for the end of the blockade remain indispensable. And we believe that it's clear that the current administration in Washington doesn't have any legal limit or moral limit to apply it against any country where they identify there are vital resources. They will apply sanctions, regulations, disinformation campaign. They will finance the subversion because it's against their national interest. And it's clear that the Global South needs to coordinate our actions. It is necessary international mobilization for raising awareness against those tools of the imperialism. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that powerful message to the Cuban people's steadfast resistance and the effects of sanctions in Cuba. So we send our gratitude to Her Excellency Yadira Ledesma Hernandez. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido.
Gracias.
Unfortunately, Ambassador Richard Lobo is unable to join us today, who was going to brief us on the effects of sanctions in Venezuela. We'll be moving forward with the rest of our scheduled program, so let's dive right to our segment. Before we proceed to our next speaker, Resist US-led War Asia Pacific campaign had prepared a short video during the launch of Asia Pacific Peace Caravan last September 2025, which we will watch now.
U.S. imperialism out of Aotearoa. U.S. imperialism out of Asia Pacific.
US out of the Philippines now. US imperialism out of Asia Pacific.
U.S. imperialism out of Aotearoa and the Philippines. U.S. imperialism out of Asia and the Pacific.
U.S. imperialism out of Asia and the Pacific.
Probably not even half the crowd is here, so we need to keep.
Out of the U.S. imperialism, U.S. out of the Philippines and Asia Pacific.
U.S. imperialism out from Indonesia. U.S. imperialism out from Asia Pacific.
U.S. out of Japan. 米国は日本から撤退しろ。Japan and U.S. out of the Philippines. フィリピンでの日米軍事活動をやめろ。
U.S. imperialist out. Yankee go home. In Korea, no war. Peaceful Korea. One Korea. Yankee go home.
U.S. imperialism out of Asia Pacific.
Thank you to Resist US-led War Asia Pacific for that video. Again, if you have any questions during the discussion, feel free to type them in the chat box at any time, and we'll have time for Q&A session after the program. And we'll do our best to address as many of your questions as possible during the allotted time. So, after hearing the crucial discussions on Cuba, now let's bring the conversation closer to home and focus on issues affecting Asia and the Pacific. Today, we have invited Erica Jung, who is a member of Nodut-dol for Korean Community Development. Nodut-dol is an organization of diasporic Koreans and comrades organizing for a world free of imperialism and for Korea's reunification and national liberation. Erica will discuss how the people of North Korea are standing up against US sanctions. Eoseo aseo. Erica, the floor is yours.
All right. Thanks so much, Johnny. And a big thank you to ILPS and the the Resist US-led War movement for organizing this event. So I'm going to be sharing a slide deck right now for this presentation. Quick. All right. Can you see my slide deck okay?
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about unilateral sanctions against the DPRK. 2026, this year, marks 76 years since the Korean War and the beginning of US-imposed sanctions on North Korea. Now, before I talk about the impacts of unilateral sanctions on North Korea, otherwise known as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, I want to tell you a bit about the Korean War. So, during the Korean War, the US killed 3 to 5 million Koreans. This is a number that essentially amounts to genocide. The US dropped more aerial bombs on the North than it did in the entire Pacific theater of World War II. In November 1950, just a few months after the start of the Korean War, General Douglas MacArthur, quote unquote, ordered that a wasteland be created between the war front and the Yalu River border, destroying from the air every installation, factory, city, and village over thousands of square miles of North Korean territory. To this day, the Korean War is still not over. The ceasefire signed in 1953 did not end the war. In fact, the US kept almost 1,000 nuclear missiles in South Korea pointed at the North for nearly 50 years. And to this day, the US occupies the South with almost 30,000 troops and regularly conducts military exercises that rehearse invasions of the North, including nuclear strikes. So it's within this context that the North Korean development of nuclear weapons is a strategy of deterrence against the threat of US imperialist aggression. What do you think would happen if the DPRK denuclearized? Would we be witnessing another Libya, which had previously been the most prosperous nation in Africa, but was then bombed by NATO and the US after being pressured to dismantle its weapons program? After the Korean War, North Korea saw levels of economic growth and success that were comparable, if not higher, than South Korea's. In the aftermath of complete devastation and loss, the country that had managed to develop a well-organized and highly industrialized socialist economy had also been able to achieve significant gains in agricultural self-sufficiency as well. So I say all this to drive home the point that sanctions are directed at successful socialist projects. They're not just about exerting influence over a region or trying to control a country's resources. Unfortunately, today, however, North Korea is now one of the most sanctioned countries in the world. Collectively, both unilateral and UN sanctions have resulted in an almost total ban on DPRK-related trade, investment, and financial transactions. And of course, it is the US that is also leveraging its permanent seat on the UN Security Council to implement multilateral sanctions through the UN. Sanctions impact the daily life of all North Koreans. From industry to agriculture and medicine, they impact everything. They can't trade with other countries, receive international loans, or much of anything else. They can in fact import fuel, but it's capped at 500,000 barrels a year, which is far below their energy needs. To put that into perspective, the US consumes over 20 million barrels every day. Under sanctions, seeds, fertilizers, and agricultural equipment and other types of machinery are banned. Contrary to popular narratives that claim North Korea's government is intentionally withholding food from its population, food insecurity in the country is driven by a lack of access to modern agricultural equipment and techniques. And it's further amplified by natural disasters and the impacts of climate change. In fact, North Korea has a public food distribution system, but it's unable to access the necessary agricultural imports from the world market. Sanctions also hugely affect the quality of healthcare available in the country. North Korea has a national public healthcare system that provides medical care to everyone free of charge. In general, its health indicators are much higher than in countries with comparably sized economies. However, because of sanctions, North Korea's healthcare system faces shortages of medicine and equipment that impact its ability to treat many preventable diseases. In fact, any items containing metal are banned. This means that the DPRK is prohibited from importing things like sterilizers, UV lamps for disinfection, syringes, needles, catheters, so much more. Unilateral US sanctions also delay or outright block vital humanitarian shipments to the North Korean people. In 2018 alone, it is estimated that there may have been more than 3,968 deaths in North Korea due to sanctions-related delays. The US condemns human rights violations in North Korea, yet in that same breath, it violates those very rights by imposing deadly sanctions and blocking humanitarian aid. The US claims to want to end the Korean War, while simultaneously imposing greater sanctions as an act of warfare, knowing full well that North Korea sees lifting sanctions as a precondition to negotiations to end the war. Despite these repressive US policies, however, North Korea has been able to resist sanctions and manage to hold its own. North Korea has persevered through enormous hardship and shown remarkable strength and determination in overcoming these many challenges. Since the arduous march, a time of famine in the 90s, the country has been gradually recovering, having developed its own technology and infrastructure to rebuild, feed, and clothe its people. Its development model is centered around its Chuche ideology, which emphasizes self-reliance, self-sufficiency, and self-confidence. The North Korean people continue to stay resilient and adapt to the many challenges they face through remarkable advancements in agriculture, energy, and textile and steel production. They find ways to circumvent US intervention and provide for their own people through the most creative and innovative means. When the shortage of raw materials from sanctions led to the shutdown of a chemical fiber production plant, North Korea started industrial production of its own synthetic fabric, Vinalon. Known as Chuche fiber, Vinalon became the national fiber of North Korea and is used to produce clothing, shoes, and ropes. North Korea has also crafted alternative means to advance its agriculture. In spite of the country's huge geographical barriers to food self-sufficiency and the restrictions placed on imports of petroleum and its byproducts, which are then used to create fertilizer, they're able to create their own circular production systems through livestock cooperative farms. All businesses, factories, schools, mining companies, and military units feed livestock for their own use. The animal excrement ends up being used as a raw material for organic fertilizer. And it allows for a much more resilient system that allows for more sustainability to the soil. And so if this were happening in the US, we would never stop hearing about this achievement in sustainable agriculture. But since it's in North Korea, we hear nothing about it. And let's talk about housing. In 2022, the DPRK began a massive push to build new modern houses across rural areas. 4 years later, 113,000 new rural units have been built in 1,860 villages and more than 500 farms. This rural housing push has been complemented by the 20 by 10 Rural Development Plan, which is building new hospitals, factories, agricultural complexes, grain storage facilities, and science and cultural centers in the countryside. In North Korea, housing is not only a priority for the country, it is a basic right, one that is guaranteed to everyone for free. The people of North Korea are adapting their lives because of sanctions in acts of resistance and survival as the national ideology of Juche manifests itself in all parts of the economy. First developed under Kim Il-sung, Juche as an ideology ingrained in Koreans the idea that they played a revolutionary role in shaping their destiny, independently, creatively, and consciously, with a high degree of awareness that they are masters of the world and their own destiny. As the US continues to wage economic warfare and escalate military tensions, the international community must accept the sovereignty of North Korea and provide support rather than isolate, vilify, or strong arm them. We need to do away with narratives that paint the government as authoritarian, corrupt, incompetent. Sanctions and the manufacture of consent for war go hand in hand in escalating the likelihood of outright invasion. Look what's happening to Iran right now. The people of the global south are not passively afflicted by poor management or poor harvest. They're actively assaulted by US imperialism in many forms, especially via strangling through unilateral sanctions. The people of the world are standing against imperialist barbarism, and socialists who pose the greatest threats to global capital, such as the DPRK, face the harshest possible backlash. And yet they're still able to march on with their heads held high. And those of us here in the Imperial Core have every responsibility to defend and support their path forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica, for your presentation and providing us with your knowledge on sanctions and its extensive effects on the people. All of our speakers today so far have delivered powerful explanations on how the people are resisting sanctions, despite the profound impact of US sanctions on the lives of the most vulnerable in society. We extend our solidarity to our siblings in Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea, and Iran. The people united will never be defeated. Next up, we have Josephine, who is a lecturer at the University of Canterbury in Aotearoa, who focuses on the study of imperialism. She recently presented a paper on contemporary imperialism at the 60th anniversary of the Tricontinental Conference in Havana, Cuba. Tēnā koe, Josephine.
Tēnā koutou katoa, dear comrades, greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand, unceded territory of Maori, a settler colonial outpost, unfortunately, of the United States and before that of Britain. I had the privilege and honor of visiting Cuba in December and January, just last month actually. And I was there to present a paper on imperialism, as you said. And I arrived in Cuba through Vancouver in Canada. And while I was in Vancouver, I noticed that there was a major homelessness crisis. People were collapsing on the streets with probably addiction and those kinds of issues. And the city just moved as if nothing was happening. And I was just taken aback by that level of poverty, homelessness I saw in one of the richest cities in settler colonial Canada. And then I arrived in Cuba, where over 95% of people have homes. I couldn't really see homelessness over there. I learned that there's some homelessness, but really negligible. So this was really shocking for me to see and surprising and awe-inspiring for me to see what this country has achieved after 65 years of an embargo by the United States. While I spent time in Cuba, I could see how the success of a worker-organized state in the areas of healthcare, in the areas of education, literacy, in the areas of social cohesion, a model of racial justice. This is not just racial justice as in inclusion in capitalist institutions or inclusion in the empire's top leadership like we saw Obama. No, this is not that. This is racial justice as in the enslaved people who were forced to build the mansions are now living in those mansions, that kind of racial justice. And this is why Cuba presents a real challenge to the empire. And when I was at the conference, which is the 60th anniversary of the Tricontinental Conference, which originally happened in 1966, it was a conference of anti-colonial radical leaders from Africa, from the Caribbean, from Asia. There were people from Vietnam. There were people from Palestine. It was it was when the Palestine movement took a truly international character. It was organized by Algerian, Moroccan revolutionaries and Fidel Castro. And I was able to listen to revolutionaries like Victor Dreke, who was the second in command to Che Guevara during the Congo mission. And while at the conference, there were also Palestinian students who were on full scholarship in Cuba, and they spoke about the education they received in Cuba as not just being a mere medical education, but a revolutionary education. And they said, I rose up after the presentation and I said, thank you for the presentation because it shows the parallel struggle that's happening between Gaza and Cuba. And and the students replied to me saying, yes, you know, Cuba, sorry, Gaza is being strangled because it is located in this extremely resource-rich region of the world, strategically important part of the world, and they have to crush the sovereignty of the people over there to maintain dominance. And on the other hand, Cuba is being suppressed, is being strangled because it represents an idea with which we can destroy imperialism. And that is the message I take from Cuba, a small country, an island nation, which does need to have interaction with the rest of the world because it doesn't produce everything. It has it had one of the best medical systems in the world, but they're suffering due to lack of supply. For example, syringes, ingredients for medicines, and so forth. We heard a Cuban doctor talk about how children with cancer in Cuba are suffering at the moment. So while the US is now currently engaged in a full-scale war with Iran, they're also implementing a genocidal siege on Cuba, a total embargo on oil. Since December, I don't think a single tanker ship with oil has arrived in Cuba. Think about the impacts it has on the transportation system and thereby the agricultural system, but also the electricity grid, which impacts hospitals, schools, and other facilities in Cuba. So thank you for all the presentations today, which connect our struggles in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Iran, in North Korea, in Aotearoa, with the primary contradiction that is facing people and the planet, which is US imperialism. I want to conclude by saying the slogan which Che Guevara, when he addressed the United Nations, he mentioned the slogan, it is a homeland or death, patria o muerte. And when we say that in Cuba, people respond with the word venceremos, which means we will overcome. So onward until victory, viva Cuba, viva la revolución, abajo el imperialismo, which means down with imperialism. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Mihi, Josephine, thank you so much for that. And thank you all so much to all our speakers for your presentations. We'll now open the floor for our Q&A session. So for anyone who has anything, please write in the comments. I have a question from the comment section here. If anyone could answer, what can we do to support people under sanctions? To the speakers.
I can go first. I think there are a variety of ways. I think especially here in the US, we see a lot of reactionary narratives coming from a lot of members of the diaspora, especially with what's happening in Iran right now. And I think when we kind of engage with those narratives, with those mainstream ones, it's our responsibility to counter them and make sure that we're not manufacturing consent for war and we're not buying into these oh, both sides can be true kind of false kind of narrative that's being fed to us. And really, we want to make sure that these false ideas that are being propagated by the US imperialist machine are not necessarily being easily believed by the majority of the working class people. And one of the speakers mentioned about how in Cuba, the US spends a lot of money on disinformation campaigns. So that's just one example of how the US manufactures consent for war, right? And it's also great to see that a lot of organizations have been rallying material support for these countries that have been impacted by sanctions. So one particular example lately is, I believe it's the People's Forum has been fundraising hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund solar panels in Cuba because you can't blockade the sun, right?
Thank you, Erica. If any of the other speakers would like to add to the question on what can we do to support people under sanctions? Yes, Yadira?
Well, thank you very much. I was touched by the presentation of Josephine, and I really appreciate all the comments also in the chat. And to try to answer your question, one of the issues that during our process we have witnessed is the importance of this articulation of different progressive forces across the world. In Cuba, we have fought different battles, and one of them was the liberation, what we call it the Cuban Five, that were imprisoned in US. They were accused as terrorists, but it was based on lies. And we developed a huge international campaign, solidarity campaign, and this power of the voices around the world have an impact on this case. We definitely free the Cuban Five. They are in Cuba, they are heroes in Cuba. But what we can address to you is that it's true that the solidarity, the international support is important, has an impact. We need to address to the public opinion, and now it's important for the progressive forces, for the peace lover individuals to address in the platform, X platform, Facebook. We need to put our ideas, our message there, because we will not have the capacity of the big medias, but at least the voices from the south need to be here, and we need to use our tools. Of course, it's important also sometimes to those demonstration acts in different cities in war. Now we have the war on Iran. We need to go to the streets to express our views against the war. This is the moment. We have also other issues. The right now the crisis in Cuba due to the fuel, etc. And we have receiving a lot of demonstrations of support across the world. Some of them are material donations, etc. But other are, some solidarity friends that they send address to the government saying you need to speak louder as a government against that policy, against that sanctions, and those demonstrations in different capitals. Because in a way, we need to try to put in the public opinion the ideas from the global south. That this is important to articulate and coordinate those kind of actions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I believe Attorney Edre also has something to add to the question of what can we do
Yeah,
to support people under sanctions.
yeah. Well, there's really so much to do, and there's a slew of possibilities. I think a lot of these are already in place. It's just a matter of intensifying, expanding, and broadening all our efforts in different fronts, no? Legal, popular, political actions, solidarity actions. I think, and that should be pursued even with more intensity, given the ferociousness of this imperialist plunder and aggression. But I'd just like to point out on a personal, even on a very simple note, one thing that is forgotten is how to counter the narrative of the demonization of countries and leaders. No? I spoke with kids. No, I have my own kid, and many in the room know I have a kid. No, and you'll be aghast that they think Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela, Iran are bad countries, huh? With bad leaders. Okay, so they look at them as from the lens of the imperialist media, corporate media. So I think one small baby step, apart from our organized efforts, of course, is to talk and speak truth to power to our families, to our kids, to our classmates, to our neighbors. We don't let it slide. When they say, okay, it's good that Iran was bombed because they're manufacturing nuclear weapons and so forth. Well, Cuba, they are impoverished. North Korea is an authoritarian state. We don't let it slide. Because over time, over time, we will counter that narrative and truth will really prevail, which will contribute in the overall struggle of what we are all doing right now. So I just like to point it out, no? Friends, families, kids, classmates, neighbors. Of course, political action is very important, no? But really, with all these barrage of false information, fake news. Sometimes, because of the algorithm, for instance, no, you are bombarded with this, and kids don't know any better. My friends in law school don't know any better because what do they read? What do they see? What do they hear? It's all from the narrative of the imperialist powers. So that's, I think, something to ponder on.
Thank you, attorney, for that. Josephine Varghese, would you like to add to that question?
Yes, I think a key site of battle, like the other speakers have identified, is that ideological and information battle that we are all, engaged in. And these kind of meetings do help with it. But at the same time, I feel most of us are inside leftist spaces. Many of us are in the West, and we can see that in the left on the left in the West, there is whenever there's an issue related to US imperialism, there is a stand that neither here nor there. We oppose US imperialism, but we won't stand with the government of Iran or Venezuela, or they will use the same language of the empire to denounce the target states of the empire, and then have some this lukewarm kind of anti-imperialist position. I think wherever we are in our spaces, we need to oppose that tendency. This is liberal imperialism. This is how 500 years of colonization happened. It's through the lukewarm opposition by the left and the so-called liberals in the West. And fighting those ideological battles, calling out the people who claim to be on the left and yet repeat the empire's colonial propaganda about North Korea, about Iran, about Cuba. That's one of the key battles I think that we need to do, even in our own spaces in the left. Thank you.
Thank you, Josephine. Our second question is, could the ambassador provide more information on how the US is stopping oil to Cuba? We heard that Russia had a tanker coming to Cuba, but somehow it was stopped, and the US plan to allow oil through pro-US forces in Cuba is laughable. From Robert Reed.
Well, on these last reinforcements of, we call it blockade offers to Cuba, is not on the public, but recent years they also were developing persecution against the enterprise and the vessels that provide oil to Cuba, with threats and also imposing fines to those companies. Nowadays, the country is applying extraordinary measures. For example, we have reduced the working days up to Thursday to try to provide more electricity to the population. We have invested from the last 2 years on the installation of big park of solar panels to provide electricity for the population. And on the case of Mexico and other countries that usually provide oils to Cuba, they receive that threat of the executive order. In case they provide oil, the US will apply tariffs for the goods they import to US. After the last sentence of the Supreme Court of US, those tariffs were declared illegal, but the intimidatory effect is already in place. It's difficult for other countries to receive more tariffs from US on their regular commerce. And then this is what's happening now. Of course, we have received support from China, from Russia. We don't know we don't have the specific details on the oil supply because now it's a sensitive information. But what we are trying to do, for example, those kids that are sick and they are connected to machines, we are providing for those families individual solar panels because those kids need to maintain connected to electricity, and there's not a stable electricity in the country right now. Also because the lack of fuel, and also because our power plants to generate electricity has been also facing the obstacles of the blockade to try to obtain uh, parts and components for the um for those big power plants. Because what happened with the blockade, if in the past we have bought, for example, parts and components for an enterprise in Germany, but now that enterprise have one actionist from the US or has technology from the US, is not allowed for the blockade to sell to Cuba anymore those parts and components. And it also happened with the medical supplies. We have in our hospital those huge machines that scan the entire body. Some of those enterprise nowadays have US actionists. Then they are not allowed anymore to sell us parts and components to repair those machines. Then the obstacles of the blockade is in every sector, from the public transportation, from the production of food because you need to fertilize, etc. Then we are trying also to implement, because the government already has planned for this kind of a scenario. We are not stopped. We have plans for those contingencies, but the humanitarian cost is huge for the population. But despite of that, also what help us is this solidarity between the Cuban population. This is something that helped us to overcome different moments of our history facing those difficulties. And we believe that this is important to raise the awareness of the public opinion, saying these civilizations are not in a position to allow those kind of violation of international law, because this civilization, for example, have survived a pandemic as COVID. What we need now as civilization is more complementarity, is more international cooperation. But this is not what we are facing. We are facing more aggressive doctrine for the imperialism in any place that there are natural resources or a geostrategic position as in Cuba. Thank you.
Thank you for ask. Thank you for us answering the questions regarding Cuba in the comment section. If there's no more questions here, I would like to ask each speaker if they have any parting words or announcements or activities that would allow the people here to be able to support or participate in. If we could begin with Attorney Edre.
Not really much to say except that let's carry on. No? All these empires, they won't be there forever. There will come a time that the people will be free, will liberate themselves. There will come a time that the people will be the ones to chart their destiny. But it takes time. It's a hard struggle, a lot of sacrifices, but it is worth the fight because if the imperialists do not tire of oppressing and oppressing, why should the oppressed people get tired? So we should overcome, and we should not be frustrated by difficulties and hardships and sometimes shortcomings, no? Because we have to put things in perspective. What can be attained in the short term, in the midterm, and in the strategic long term. If we take a good grasp of those things, we won't feel hopeless. We won't feel frustrated because every single step is a step towards the direction of liberating our peoples from imperialist powers. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Yadira, if you would like to add anything, parting words or announcements.
Okay, thank you. Well, I believe that you will notice that from Latin America in particular, maybe during this year we will be developing some campaigns of raising awareness, and the campaign Hands of Latin America, Hands of Venezuela, Hands of Cuba, and it will be important to try to replicate those kind of actions of solidarity and against the imperialism across the world. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll pass it on to Erica Jung next.
Yeah, I just want to kind of emphasize the importance of being part of an organization or more generally a collective and being able to combat US imperialism. I'm really grateful to be a member of Noruto and to be able to be part of an organization that's constantly working to organize and mobilize the Korean diaspora. And there's just so much to look forward to in a way because more and more people are being fed up with US lies and US wars. And so I think there's a lot of momentum that we can take advantage of.
Thank you. Josephine Varghese.
Oh, I just want to reiterate what every other speaker said, and just to try and make use of every opportunity within our organizations to educate on imperialism and the global imperial system, which is headed by the United States, which is a system that is there to concentrate the value and resources, the labor of the world, whatever is created from it, in the hands of this tiny billionaire class at the cost of people and the planet. And the more we get people to see this larger picture, the closer we are to victory. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for the discussion. And thank you again to all our speakers, Attorney Edre, Her Excellency Yadira, and Erica for your powerful insights and solidarity. And thank you to our reactor, Josephine, for providing updates on the situation in Cuba. So thank you all for all of you who have joined us, listened, engaged, and made this conversation meaningful. But before we close, let's take a moment to capture the shared moment. So we'll pause our screens real quick for a group photo and screenshot just before I close the meeting today. I'm not sure when it's... Webinar on sanctions. Though our webinar on sanctions, and here our struggle continues as a continuation of solidarity and action against the covert weapon of war. We'll continue to build our solidarity between peoples resisting imperialist aggression and intervention. Thank you to the co-organizers of this webinar, Resist US-Led War Movement, Asia and the Pacific Campaign, International League for People's Struggle, Asia and the Pacific, Philippines Bolivarian Venezuela Friendship Association, Philippines Cuba Friendship Association, or Amistad. And thank you for your time, and we hope to see you in the next webinar. End all sanctions now.